Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with me, Mr. Snyder, and today we're going to talk about the Cold War heating up with some other indirect skirmishes and battles around the world. So by 1950, the U.S. and the Soviet Union are the two most powerful countries in the world by far. We have conflicting ideologies, and our goals lead to a worldwide struggle for influence. Our policies that we use against each other in 1950s foreign policies helped shape the history of the 20th century for much of the world, from places we're going to talk about today in the Middle East and Latin America. So in 1949, just 4 years after the U.S. gets their own atomic bomb, the U.S. discovers that the Soviets have successfully tested an atomic bomb. That means the U.S. no longer has this monopoly on atomic weaponry, and we're not the only ones that can blow up a bomb anymore. Intelligence officials in the United States thought that the Soviets were years away from developing an atomic weapon on their own, and here they've done it in 1949. We then find out that they had spies inside the Manhattan Project, and we'll get to that in our next lesson. But this marks the beginning of the arms race, because both sides will continue to stockpile increasingly powerful nuclear weapons. So now that they have an atom bomb, Truman orders the development of the hydrogen bomb, which is 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. And it's controversial. Albert Einstein doesn't like it. Oppenheimer doesn't like it because it would lead to a perpetual arms race, in their opinion. We test our first H-bomb in 1952, and the Soviets do it the year after. So it is an ever-increasing arms race. U.S. and Soviets begin to take these atomic weapons and arm planes, submarines, and the tips of missiles with nuclear warheads throughout the Cold War. And this leads to the theory or the philosophy of mutually assured destruction. If we both have nuclear weapons that could destroy the other country many times over, then we will not attack each other. Because if we fire our nukes and they fire their nukes, when we fire ours, we are essentially saying that we are going to die as well. So this is the reason the U.S. and the Soviet Union doesn't attack one another. Eisenhower, when he is elected in 1952 and re-elected in 1956, takes a different approach to foreign policy. He makes John Foster Dulles his Secretary of State. And Dulles is extremely anti-communist. And he feels that Truman's approach of containment is useful in preventing a domino effect in Southeast Asia, which is if one country in the region falls to communism, the rest will follow, just like a row of dominoes falling over. Eisenhower feels that containment, however, has dragged the United States into several regional conflicts that had been draining the country's resources, like the Korean War, like the Berlin airlift, are examples that are draining the country's resources. So he goes ahead and switches military spending from conventional forces like troops, ships, tanks, and artillery to stockpiling nuclear weapons and building the planes, missiles, and submarines that are necessary to deliver those. Because it's more efficient to just use nuclear weapons on a place versus fighting a conventional war and losing troops and whatnot. So why not stockpile our nuclear weapons? And both Eisenhower and Dulles, like I said, are extremely anti-communist, and the official policy is called massive retaliation. So instead of containment of communist threats, the U.S. will respond to any communist threats by threatening to use massive, sometimes even nuclear force. And foreign policy shifts from a type of containment to what we call brinksmanship. So brinksmanship and massive retaliation could both be correct answers for Eisenhower's new foreign policy. Brinksmanship is willing to go to the brink of all-out war to prevent or to keep the peace. It is the practice of threatening an enemy with massive retaliation for any aggression that they show. In 1953, we get a change in leadership in the Soviet Union because Joseph Stalin dies. There are conspiracy theories that he was poisoned, but he dies. And relations cool a little bit between the Soviet Union and the U.S. due to this power struggle. And in 1953, later on, Nikita Khrushchev succeeds Stalin as leader of the Soviet Union in 1953. He's not as suspicious or as cruel as Stalin was. He believes that communism is going to take over the world, but he believes it will do it peacefully. And in 1955, Khrushchev and Eisenhower even meet in Switzerland at a conference in Geneva. And even though nothing was accomplished there, it's a small move toward peaceful coexistence between the two countries. There are some uprisings underneath Khrushchev because he's not as cruel as Stalin. People thought that they could get out from under the Iron Curtain because these people resent control of their country by the Soviet Union. And those two places are Poland and Hungary in the same year. Poland, 100,000 people protest the dictatorship in Poland that is pro-Soviet. And they decide, they protest and they actually win greater control. There's people killed, of course, but they win greater control over their government because they agreed to remain in the Warsaw Pact, where the Soviet Union has control over them as well. And Hungary, in 1956, they see Poland have success, so why can't they have success? They rise up against their Stalinist government. They want a democracy. Khrushchev then responds with Soviet tanks and rolls them in and kills 30,000 Hungarians and executes the movement's leaders. The U.S. did not intervene during this, nor Poland, because we are not going to use nuclear weapons or massive retaliation to guarantee either country's independence from the Soviet Union. Nasser is the Egyptian president, and he wants to construct a dam on the Nile River to profit for his country. And he plays the United States and the Soviet Union against one another so he can get the best deal. We offer to fund the project, but then he opens talks with the Soviet Union and China, and we're not going to do it at that point. We withdraw our offer. So when we refuse to do it, he then places the Suez Canal under government control, which is called nationalizing something when it comes under government control. And it used to be controlled by a British and French company, and that's no longer the case now that they've nationalized it, so it threatens the flow of oil through the Suez Canal to Europe. So Britain and France joined together with Israel, who is in the region, and they don't like the Arab nation of Egypt, so they take control of the Suez Canal to prevent any threats to Israeli shipping either. And they did this without U.S. approval. Eisenhower is very upset. He condemns these actions when they thought he would support them, and he cuts off the oil supply to Britain and France from the United States. So without U.S. control, the three nations decide to withdraw their troops from Egypt. And this leads to the Eisenhower Doctrine, because the Middle East is the new battleground for the Cold War, and the U.S. says that they would defend any Middle Eastern country against an attack by any communist country. So it's the Truman Doctrine, but specifically to the Middle East, and it's called the Eisenhower Doctrine. And we actually do send troops to Lebanon in 1958 to put down a revolt against the pro-American government there. Also, the CIA is formed around this time. It's first an intelligence gathering organization, and it comes from the World War II, gathering information during that time. Eisenhower gives it the task of carrying out secret operations to weaken or overthrow governments that are ultimately a threat to the United States, and those are called covert operations. Two early missions were in Iran, and that's why Iran and the United States don't have a very good relationship today, because we overthrow their prime minister and install someone who is pro-American and pro-Western countries, the Shah of Iran, and later on they will take control over our embassy there, and we'll have to deal with the Iran hostage crisis in 1979, 1980. He also uses it for a similar purpose in Guatemala in Latin America. And then finally, we can't get into the Cold War without talking about the space race. And in 1957, the race to space is won by the Soviets. They launch Sputnik, or Sputnik, as they would say. It's the world's first artificial satellite. You know, the moon is a satellite of the Earth, so we can't call it a satellite. It's an artificial satellite. Basically, it's a fancy radio antenna. If you had the right kind of radio, you could hear it beeping going overhead. But it scares the crap out of America, because what if they could use this technology to drop missiles on American cities? That was a real concern at that point. And also, the next month, they launch a larger satellite carrying a living creature. Lakia was hailed as a Soviet hero. She's a dog. And there's no way to get her back to Earth, but they could keep track of her vitals and stuff. And she dies in space because there's no way to bring her home. So somewhere up there, Lakia is floating around. The Americans had been beaten to space, and we immediately pour our money and efforts into our own space program called NASA, or the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, which coordinates our space-related efforts between scientists and the military. And we also need to create more little scientists so we can defeat the Soviets and get better technology created. So the National Defense Education Act passes $1 billion to entice high school and college graduates to enter the sciences and study to be a scientist. Schools reorganize their curriculum around math and science, whereas before it was more about being a good citizen and social studies. And that emphasis is still there today. So that's all I have for you about the Cold War heating up, so to speak. If you have any questions, bring them back to class, and I will see you then. Have a good night.